This episode is powered by Dialect Imports, taste the language of Italian terroir.
Christina is a second-generation wine importer and the CEO and co-founder of Dialect Imports, with a portfolio that strongly features female producers. At just age 30, she brings a fresh perspective and entrepreneurial drive to Italian wine in the U.S. So what we're excited to dive into with you, Christina, our first takeaway, multi-generational continuity. Italian wine endures as a living tradition where family knowledge gets passed down through generations, but we have to continually adapt to today's global market. Second, talking about women in wine and how women are reshaping the industry, especially from the Italian perspective. And then third, scarcity and variety. So talking about the hundreds of native grape varieties and hyperlocal styles that are uniquely Italian and what this offers in terms of diversity and rare expressions to connect with new consumers. So let's dive in. Good topics. Welcome to Masterclass U.S. Wine Market with me, Barbara Fitzgerald. In this show, we'll break down the complexities of selling wine in the U.S. by discussing the relevant issues of today with experts from around the globe. Each episode serves up 3 key insights to help elevate your winery's presence in the U.S. market. So grab a pen and paper and let's pave the way for your success in the U.S. Hello, welcome to Masterclass U.S. Wine Market. Today, I am very excited to welcome Christina Solazzo to the show. Christina is a second-generation wine importer and the CEO and co-founder of Dialect Imports. She holds an MBA and an MA in food studies from Chatham University's Falk School of Sustainability, a BA in Sociology from the College of Wooster, and WSET Level 2. She was first introduced to the industry through her father's import company and has built her own career in partnership management, events, and marketing for food and wine organizations. With Dialect Imports, Christina champions multi-generational wineries rooted in the hyperlocal traditions of Italian culture with a portfolio that strongly features female producers. At just age 30, she brings a fresh perspective and entrepreneurial drive to Italian wine in the U.S. Thank you so much for joining us, Christina. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Very excited to be here with you as well. Thank you.
My pleasure. And so before we dive into today's discussion, can you tell us a little bit more about your background, Christina, and how you came to work in the wine business?
Yeah, so my family is Italian American on both sides. My dad had been an avid collector for much of my childhood and then had decided to take the dive in, or midlife crisis, as you might call it, to do wine importing as a side job. During that time, I was introduced to a lot of the producers. I would travel with them. This is when I was between the ages of 11 and 16. I got to know them. And, I would say that formally I entered the industry at age 19 with my first internship at Taberni in Umbria. But I grew up as, a cellar rat effectively and, was always tasting and getting to know the wines that way. So first got into the industry by interning with Gianpaolo Taberni at his winery in Montefalco. I continued to work with him, whether on site at the winery during the summers or remotely helping them with stuff while I was in the States for about 5 years. And I just became really passionate about Italian wine in particular. I made it my business to take any course I could about Italy or wine or food or agricultural more generally so that I could, effectively, I joke that I developed like the blueprint class schedule to study that at my school. And I somehow convinced them, it was a small liberal arts school in the middle of cornfields in Ohio, and I somehow convinced them to give me funding on like 3 occasions to study wine in Italy. So I feel like that's probably one of my proudest accomplishments. But no, I ended up going to do study abroad in Italy as well. So I was there for collectively throughout my college time, I would say I was there for about a year or more, but, had worked with Gianpaolo. I did other internships with the study abroad program, as well as with the U.S. wine importer in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And when I was looking for next steps, I knew I wanted to go into the industry, but wanted a little bit more of, expertise on that. So I decided to pursue graduate school. My thesis for that program actually served as the basis for Dialect Imports today. And so in many ways, it feels like it's been a long time coming, but it's been a step-by-step process for sure.
I mean, this is amazing how much you've accomplished and championed, Italian wine, and you're 30 years old. I also have to give a quick plug. I am the biggest fan of Tabarini, and whenever I'm referencing like the romance of like Italian unique wine characters, but also like the perfect, I think, blend of innovation and heritage, he's my go-to. So I'm so glad to know you were part of that team.
Yeah, John Paulo is, I really struggle to identify someone who's had more of an impact on my life than John Paulo. I would describe him as an uncle. My dad and him regularly refer to each other as brothers. But when I was at the winery, I lived with his parents, Franca and Nello, and they regularly joke with me. They're like, when are you getting married? Because it's happening here and we're going to die soon. So like, come on, we need to take this on. But he's incredible person. He's just, like you said, innovative. What he's done with the winery, just the ability that he has to look at things as if he were an engineer is just incredible to see. So, but yeah, he's fantastic.
Amazing. Well, we could talk about, the romance again of Tabarini and Montefalco and Umbria for this whole episode. But, I think we have some different key takeaways for this episode. So what we're excited to dive into with you, Christina, our first takeaway, just multi-generational continuity. So Italian wine endures as a living tradition where family knowledge gets passed down through generations, but we have to continually adapt to today's global market. Second, talking about women in wine and how women are reshaping the industry, especially from the Italian perspective, leaving a lasting influence on how Italian wine is made and shared. And then third, the kind of scarcity and variety. So talking about the hundreds of native grape varieties and hyperlocal styles that are uniquely Italian and what this offers in terms of diversity and rare expressions to connect with new consumers. So let's dive in. Good topics. Well, let's start with this multi-generational piece. I myself am also multi-generational Italian family here in the US. In the wine world, you said the same of yourself, and you describe Italian wine itself as a living tradition. So how are you balancing, honoring the historical heritage, the legacy practices, while also introducing innovations that resonate with a younger or more international audience?
I think my background, a lot of it is in events. And I think that's a key way that I see of, engaging younger audiences with wine today is, there's a lot of discussions on, are Gen Z or millennials even, like, are they not drinking as much? How do we see the difference of this? But I mean, when I look at how do we get people engaged with these, discussions, whether it's these legacies or the innovations that are happening in Italian wine, you need to give them an experience so that they can actually consume that. Because not everyone is going to Italy, right? That's not new, but it's finding how to engage the younger people with that I think is really key, especially when you're talking about international audiences. What might resonate in Italy doesn't necessarily resonate in the United States. But I think, viewing it for multi-generational in particular, not just as this is the next generation, but this is the future. I think that has a bigger impact on the US audience.
Definitely. I think that's such an important distinction that you make too, that we need these kind of cultural translators because, what is interesting to a younger audience in Italy isn't necessarily what's different to a younger audience in the US. And given that we have such a diverse base here in the US, even what is interesting to somebody young in New York is probably not the same as what's interesting to somebody young in St. Louis.
Yeah.
Do you have some practical tips that you can give for ways that you've seen really resonate well with these younger audiences, especially in terms of how to bring, as you mentioned, not everyone can go to Italy. So what are some maybe ways that you've seen work really well that brings Italy to these younger audiences?
Well, I mean, one way is, first of all, bringing the producers themselves when you're able to do producer visits. I think that really makes it a lot more tangible for someone to see this is who this person is, especially when you're talking about next gen. So, we recently had Marco Yupa in from Sicily, and he's the next generation for his, he's their new winery, but he's the next generation. He's a young person. We're going to have Andrea Piccin from Grafalco coming in. Chiara Candela will be coming. Having these folks that people can actually meet and put a face to makes it more, oh, okay, so this is real. This is this actual person who's doing this work. And I think that goes a long way. And again, that's not new, but also with the events, doing it in fun and interesting ways. I've seen last night, for instance, we had one of our accounts did a night where they were pairing up different wines with different music. And, our rep and then the account contact. They chose the different songs and they paired the wines. And it was just like a fun night. But it wasn't like your typical, like, okay, let's just sniff, spit, and, you know, your typical traditional Italian wine event. I see that here as well is, you know, having these events that are maybe you don't have quite as much of the storytelling aspect, but you're getting these events that are designed to get the label in front of the consumer. And I think that, honestly, I think that's the biggest thing is label recognition for consumers is a huge way to get them to actually recognize the brand and to keep that with them moving forward. And when you have events designed in a way that emphasize that over perhaps going over like the history of the winery, I think that that really travels through for them a lot more. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble. I don't know if that answers the question.
Don't ever apologize. It's like a very organic conversation. So yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think that events like this are so interesting because by pairing something like wine and music together, you're inviting music lovers to this opportunity and you're kind of, you know, getting them there on their own terms. So they're already feeling relaxed. They're already engaging with something else that they really love, probably making them more of a sponge to soak in these stories that you're trying to tell about the winery rather than just kind of being in a lecture style, like here's these facts, this fact, this fact, this fact.
I agree 100%. I think, you know, the lecture style tasting, it has a purpose. And I think it can be extremely useful. And I think that, you know, that shouldn't go away. But I think that that's for so long been the only way to engage people with wines. And when you're looking at, you know, maybe you have someone who's a collector or they're someone in the industry, right? They have that expertise. That's great for them. But when you're talking about people who aren't really familiar with the wine, or whether they're not familiar with wine in general, or, you know, Italy has so many different types of grapes, they might not know that region or that specific variety. Getting to find a way to meet them on their own terms, I think has such a better impact for people actually being able to, you know, enjoy the wine rather than feeling like they shouldn't be there because they don't know, they're not engaging with it in the way that you would want to in like that scholastic lecture style setting.
I think, yeah, you're so right. Like also maybe differentiating the trade versus the consumer audience and giving them those different styles, right?
For sure.
Well, let's talk a little bit about family succession, which is a really big part of Italian wine. To be honest, I don't watch the TV show Succession yet. I will someday, but what I gather is it's not smooth. So what do you see are kind of biggest pitfalls in multi-generational wineries, and how can you kind of give some advice to families to avoid them?
Well, I guess if I can turn around, I would say the biggest successes I see with it are when they don't force it. You know, you have to have someone who chooses that that's what they actually want to go forward and do. And I think that there's definitely a big cultural pressure on, you know, if you have the family winery, you need to continue that forward. But if you let, you know, the next generation choose what they want to do, and it just so happens that that is with the wine business, then that's a legitimate choice they've made. And there isn't going to be like this begrudging, you know, continuation going forward with it. I would also say what's interesting to see is when you have siblings, and we have a number of these in our portfolio where, you know, you have these 2 or 3 siblings who what they've done is in line with that is they've split up with what their interests are. So maybe one of them is more into the enology side. They're the winemaker. One of them is more into the admin. You know, you'll usually see that type of divide. Someone who does like the office work and then someone who's in the cellar or the fields. And I think that allows them to take ownership over their own part, their own aspect of that process without stepping on each other's shoes. I will say also something that I've seen is from our own experience as an importing business is, generally speaking, when you have daughters, when you have a father-daughter business, you have, I would say, less of an issue between the generational divide.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, you know, it goes back to when you talk about fathers with daughters live longer, or daughters keep better contact with their family. I would say maybe, I don't necessarily know if it's like, you know, there isn't that ego that's competing, but yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like your kind of main call out is clear division of roles to make this transition smooth. And I see that happening really beautiful in a lot of the Italian wineries I love. What always comes to mind for me when I think of succession is like Salvafotti and I Vigneri and his two sons, Simone and Andrea, or like the Ferrari family, like that has, I'm the biggest fan of Ferrari sparkling wine. So, but just the way that everyone divides their roles in very clear ways. And it seems like they're growing in such smooth ways. Are there other brands maybe part of your portfolio that you want to call out?
I mean, I would say Barone Sergio, for example. So that's two sisters, Angela and Luigia. They're in Sicily. They're actually who I was thinking of when I was saying, they weren't in the business. Luigia was initially working in fashion. Angela went out and became a lawyer. And then around COVID, they just had this like longing for home. They decided to come back and, become the next generation. They took over from their father, and Angela does more of the admin work. Luigia is more in the cellar in the fields, and that's how they've been able to divide it amongst each other. But they're an example of who I think of who's done like a very clear next generational move, looking at what they've done with events at their winery, how they've used artwork on the estate, and they've utilized similarly with the labels to really make this clear statement of we are the next generation, we are female producers, this is what we're doing. I would say also with Tibaldi, they're one of our producers out of Piedmont in the Roero area. And, Monica and Daniela, I would say they share a lot of the same responsibilities, but something they've been able to do is like, as one of them, because they are women, right? So as they have children, they've divided up who is able to be away longer or who's able to go do the market visits and such. And I think having just that clear communication with each other about who is doing what responsibility is really critical.
Well, that's a really great segue into talking about women in wine. Italian wine has been pretty historically patriarchal, but today we're seeing more women leaders than ever. Not just at wineries, right? At consortiums and marketing campaigns, et cetera. So where do you think the most impactful changes are happening right now? And maybe also like where do you see the most room for growth?
I think where I would see the most impactful changes is honestly, I would say in part with the marketing aspect. I think that for a really long time, wine occupied, the idea of who is the wine drinker, who are you marketing to as the wine drinker, were these Napa cab, male consumers. And I think where we've seen is finally this shift in the market that they understand who the consumer is. And so you've seen each of the steps now, whether it's the consortio, the wineries, the marketing campaigns, they're actually matching up with that now. And I think now what we're seeing with the importance of that catch up is the leaders in each of those realms are women. And so it's not just, men making the decisions about what female consumers are drinking, but it's female producers saying, this is what I want to do for my label. This is what I want to do for the type of wine that I want to make. These are how I want to be approaching, the agronomy for our winery. And I think that goes a lot further than when it before was just saying, okay, well, this is who we've had as our set demographic, and it's going to remain that way. And that's how we're going to approach it.
Yeah. I wonder also a little bit beyond production, like also influence of women as journalists. We've been talking about marketers, importers. So how do you see that this shift is changing the stories that get told about Italian wine, and especially, in regards to, in the US market?
I think in terms of the stories that get told about Italian wine, I think what we're seeing now is, less of an ego of the prestige of a winery and more of the reality of the work that goes into it. I think that there's a better appreciation, shown, quite frankly, from journalists when talking to producers about, not the pretty stuff that goes into the winemaking, but, the grueling tasks, how there's work to be done with that and the reality of it, and less of this prestige of a storied or famed winemaker. In the history of that, it's instead talking about the work that needs to go into every day into making this product and to maintaining, this legacy. And that being the legacy is the work.
Yeah. How about, in the US where female wine professionals are really shaping consumer culture at every level. A lot of studies showing that right now it's females really leading the demographic of sales for wine, especially at the millennial level, which is the highest value purchaser of wine at the moment. How can Italian producers better leverage this dynamic when positioning their wine to American audiences?
I would say, honestly, making it apparent that it's a female producer, if you are a female producer. I mentioned Tibaldi and Barone Sergio. Tibaldi, on their label, it's a caricature drawing of the two sisters together, every single one of their bottles. And when they first started, they got a lot of, I would say, complaints or ridicule from fellow producers about how, why are you doing this? It's just two young girls on this label. Why are you doing that? And what I've seen from consumers in terms of how they can relate to that, and then also from distributors that we work with, is they are finding that people are attracted to and are empathetic towards seeing that label on the shelf. Is they see that and they say, oh, I love this. That's a great label. Barone Sergio, similarly. I think that marketing shouldn't be discounted as just like, oh, it's just an Instagram post or it's just this. I think it goes further. I think it's, how are you leveraging things such as this interview? How are you doing, your market work when you're going into the States? What type of events are you doing? How are you making sure that your websites are telling your story appropriately? And then on the labels, I think that's really the biggest thing that I've seen is the impact of the label, because we're seeing retailers choose wines based off of label artwork more so than, if they think this will resonate with people, will this actually be something that people want to grab? And I think that, when you have that element, I think that to me, that's something that shouldn't be discounted as like a throwaway, but should be looked at as, this is what people are responding to, and we need to, meet them on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so true because people don't just shop with their wallets, right? They shop with their eyes, especially in a setting where trial isn't an option, like in a retail store or a grocery store. And so, it's kind of like if your label has, this beautiful villa on it, it doesn't stand out, right?
No.
It's got to have some element that makes it its own.
And I think it's differentiating for, again, as we're talking just about multi-generational too, is this going to have the same archaic, drawing that we see of a villa or a chateau on every bottle that looks like every other bottle that's on the shelf? And I think instead the way to do that is to identify that this is newer, this is different. You can have those historical notes on the label for sure, but making sure that people understand what the ethos of the winery is, more so than, this person having knowledge of what this very minute DOCG is, right? Like they need to be able to recognize that without having to do an entire course. So I think to the degree that people can do that, whether it's, making an attractive front label and then on the back label, utilizing either QR codes or having some type of excerpt or a map to show where the winery is located or what it's about, that goes a long way. And I think just, to the extent that the producer is able to make more accessible an understanding of what their wine is to someone who's just looking on the shelf, or who is at the restaurant trying to flip through the menu or asking for a recommendation, I think that goes much further in the US than, maybe in Italy. They don't need that. In Italy, it's more understood, that level of education on the wine. So I think in the US, having a little bit more of a accessibility in terms of what you need to know to actually understand the wine.
Yeah, definitely. We don't have the same cultural inheritance here, right? Of wine. Maybe you and I do, but so it's like you really need to make it accessible in a way that it's reminding yourself, I think, that you're not marketing to yourself and you're not marketing to the people that you know.
Yeah.
Get to know the markets that you are trying to reach. What is their general interest level? What would make it helpful for them to feel more connected to your wine, to be more drawn to it as opposed to like a barrier that maybe just causes confusion or something like that.
Yeah.
So I would say that, many American consumers have really discovered Italian wine through a handful of iconic brands and regions. So how can these second generation importers, especially maybe in some smaller, lesser known areas of Italy, expand this lens for American consumers without losing the power of tradition?
I think that those big name brands are important. I think that they are necessary, and I think that they allow people to get hooked. And I think that that hook shouldn't be discounted just because it's a big name brand, or, if it's lesser expensive, going with that as well. I think that for, the producers or importers who are working with portfolios from lesser known areas and trying to say, like, is this going to be a problem? I think it's a differentiating factor. I think that there's a lot of wines on the market, and I think that having these lesser known areas, double-edged sword. Yes, you have more of a hand sell bottle, but you have something that's new, that's interesting, and that people might not have heard of before and they're not exhausted by. And I think that having palates get exhausted is going to happen at every level of the consumer. But I think, being able to easily identify, okay, maybe you don't know what this grape is, but what do you like? Okay, if you like this, what else would you enjoy? What else would be something of interest to you? I think just finding the right hook for people. It might be that, their gateway wine. Okay, so for instance, Favorita. Okay, not a lot of people will know Favorita, but it's technically Vermentino, right? Maybe they know Vermentino, or they know another grape that, they like the floral notes. They like, for Roero, especially in that area, this is a grape that they really enjoy, but, they don't really know what it is they enjoy about it. Chiara Candello is one of our producers, and she produces a Sangiovese di Prodapio in Emilia-Romagna. Not necessarily what Emilia-Romagna is known for. Most people, when they think of the big name brands coming out of there, they'll say Lambrusco. But they know Sangiovese, right? That's, maybe, and like you said, they might struggle to pronounce it. But when we have something like that, Sangiovese is a grape that people will know, but maybe they know it from Tuscany. Maybe they know it from Brunello. But when they have the Sangiovese di Prodapio that Chiara is known for, this is something that's different. And if you do a side-by-side comparison, one of my favorite things to do is when we're visiting with accounts, we do a side-by-side for them of these two varieties from different regions and different producers. And it might be the same vintage, but they can taste it. And it's like having this experiment wrapped up to see what is the impact of terroir. Obviously, there's going to be a difference of winemaking styles and techniques, but seeing how different those varieties can taste and the impact of these different areas that maybe they don't know is just crucial to getting people to understand what makes the wines different from what they're already drinking.
Yeah. And as we mentioned, there are so many native varieties in Italy and many, hyper-local styles. But do you think that the retailers and the restaurants in the US are prepared to champion this diversity, or are you seeing kind of like a bottleneck in terms of gatekeepers kind of only pushing the more safe bets? Like, what's your experience so far, and how can we push it forward?
I think it's not so much that they're gatekeeping because they don't want to take the risk or they want to take the safe bet. I think a lot of it comes down to they don't know how to discuss it. We've seen this with, for example, with our Yupa producer out of Etna. They produce an Etna Bianco Superiore, which can only be produced in their area. And getting retailers to understand the difference between an Etna Bianco and an Etna Bianco Superiore. There's going to be a big price difference in that. There's going to be a big difference in quality. It's not so much that it's, a safer bet that they're not willing to take, but what they are struggling to understand is how to translate that story to a consumer. You're talking about cultural translators before. To me, that's an example of it. Is you'll have someone in the US who is just like, I don't really get the difference. This is from Etna. This other wine is also from Etna. They're both called Bianco. They're both white wines. What makes them that drastically different? And I think that when you have retailers that are willing to get on board with that storytelling, and I think that comes down to partnering with retailers or restaurants who aren't these big, big box stores. They're these hole in the wall neighborhood wine shops that you love and want to get behind. And I think they're the ones who can tell that story, and, they're the actual influencers for their consumers, for their clients that come in. They trust them, and they maybe don't know much about that wine, but when they are talking to that retailer, they know that they're going to give them the explanation that they need to know that I can take a bet on this bottle being what I want it to be, or be interested by it at least, without it being, as significant a risk of doing like a blind bet.
Yeah. I mean, again, biased because I speak Italian, so do you. When I think about something like Etna Bianco Superiore, hopefully, because Superiore is just superior with an E on the end. I'm like, hopefully that has a little bit, some people are able to recognize that even without speaking Italian, but I fully get what you're saying. It's, it's kind of like some regions have, style classifications that have the same name, but just a couple more words added on after the fact. And that can be really confusing to an audience that doesn't speak Italian or read Italian.
Well, and I think even beyond the language aspect, I think it's a cultural element. As I think in the US, yeah, we have some ABAs, but we don't have this like inherent understanding of differentiating quality like that, right? I think that that is something that is just built into the fabric of what makes the Italian wine industry the way it is. And I think it can be very helpful. Like you said, it can help people distinguish, like, you can see, okay, if there's a DOC and then a DOCG, okay, I know that the G gives it a little bit of an extra quality, right? If I know this has superiority at the end, okay, I can take a bet and say this is going to be a higher level quality wine. But I think it's a cultural element more so than the language for American consumers not always understanding the importance of these categorical differences between quality levels. And I think that, it's a big part of that is just the variety in Italy. There's just so many varieties, there's so many DOCs, the terroir is super unique. And we don't have something that can compete on that scale in the US to be able to point to as like an easy example. Because again, we do have ABAs, but we don't have them at quite the, I would say, obsession that we do in Italy. so there just isn't a clear cut counterpart in the US.
Yeah. Well, with so much conversation about Gen Z and millennials being more adventurous, more willing to experiment in their drinking, do you think they're ready for this complexity of Italy's microregions, or do we risk overwhelming them?
I think we are. I think what we're seeing with the Gen Z and millennial drinkers in a lot of ways is less of, and there's a lot of discussion with them as well about like, oh, are they not drinking or how, what are the dangers of that? I think they're being more particular about what they want to drink. So I actually think it's in the favor of Italian winemakers, quite frankly, because I think what their behavior is showing is that they don't want to be over drinking as much, but they want to be enjoying what they're drinking. And, they want to be selective about the experience that they're taking part in. And so I think when we look at Italian wine and we look at, the educational element, I know so many people who are Gen Z or my age who are doing WSET courses for fun. That's their after work activity that they're doing for themselves. They aren't in the industry. They wouldn't describe themselves as the biggest wine fanatic, but it's a way for them to learn about an activity that, they'll theoretically be engaging in for the rest of their lives, right? If you're someone who enjoys wine and wants to drink wine, you're not looking to not drink, they want to be an informed consumer. And I think that that's to the benefit of Italian producers, because what you have then is someone who's legitimately interested in the story, who's legitimately interested in learning about what makes this different from that wine, rather than having someone who is just looking to drink a lot of a wine that they know and are familiar with. You have someone, like you said, they're adventurous, but I think it's beyond being adventurous. I think it's informed consumerism. I think it's someone who's they're excited to learn about something that they don't know, and they're willing to be uncomfortable in that process to learn about it.
You said people my age, my generation. Just for clarity, are you a millennial or are you Gen Z?
I'm a millennial, so I'm 30. I'm on the cusp. I'm a young millennial, but I'm very much so millennial, not Gen Z.
Okay.
So I think the cutoff is 97, I want to say. So, but yeah, I'm very much so in the millennial sphere.
Amazing. Okay, last question on this. You brought up scarcity, that it can be both a selling point and a challenge. So how do you convey the value of wines that, may only have a production of a few thousand bottles without alienating newer consumers?
I think they enjoy that. I think that the scarcity is an attractive quality for the wine, especially when you're talking about Gen Z and millennials. I think we want this something that's unique, right? It's not something that everybody else can have, for better or worse. I think that they're okay with that. I think on the other side, where I've seen the best, just from a business element, the producers that have done a really good job of this is they'll have those wines in their own portfolios that they produce only a few thousand bottles of. But then they have a lower end entry wine for people that they produce in a larger quantity. And so that's been critical for getting more of an amassed, I would say, market share for them. Because, then what we have is someone who's able to, yes, they do something that is a smaller production. They are, a small producer. What they're doing is unique, it's rare, there's a scarcity element, but it's still accessible. And I think the key to that too is the danger you run if everything a winemaker produces is only scarce. Pricing wise, that's the element, is you're pricing out those new consumers because they can't all afford to spend $50 to $75 on this rare bottle of wine. You need to produce something at the same time that can be purchased in that like $15 to $30 range. And I say 15 to 30 because I think what we're seeing a lot of in the States in particular is, these markups on the wine that can make them more inaccessible than perhaps producers are anticipating. And so, sometimes you'll see a markup where someone can go and they can purchase it without a problem. But when you see these other markups, you risk alienating the consumer at that point. And so I think the scarcity and value of that comes into understanding both from the consumers, the retailers, and the producers themselves as to what they need to be doing and able to keep those balanced and not cutting people out of the equation.
Definitely. Okay, what is some maybe sound advice you want to give to someone in the next generation, whether it's, a young woman who wants to enter the trade or a second generation family member stepping into leadership? What advice would you give them about shaping Italian wine's future in the US?
I would say become your own expert. Certainly rely on the experts around you, but be able to learn about and study as much as you can on the topic so that when you are talking to people about it, you're not just relying on what somebody else has told you. I think a lot of what I would say was huge for me was being able to speak Italian. I was able to meet with producers who perhaps they don't speak English at all, or, they speak very little English. And what that enabled me to do was be able to find people who are underrepresented in the US or didn't have representation and who are doing incredible work, but just might not have been known. Francesca Fiasco is someone specifically I'm thinking of. She is so talented. I absolutely love her. What she's doing is incredible. She's situated in the Cilento National Park, and she does Pastum Bianco and Rossos. She does these really incredible field blends. And what I've seen with that is, when I met with her, I was able to speak in Italian. I was able to get to know her, build a relationship with her, and then come to the US and talk about what she's doing and explain that story to the people that I encounter in the retail, in the restaurant, even with my own team members and our board members. If I instead had not been able to speak Italian, if I had not put in the effort to find someone who was under the radar like her, I would just be talking about someone who everyone's already heard about, they already know. And I think that by becoming your own expert, you can be adventurous. And just like we were talking about with the consumer, it goes the same for people who are in the industry. By becoming your own expert and pushing yourself to learn about this, you can be more adventurous with who you choose to work with, whether that's the producers, the distributors, the retailers that you want to work with, what states you want to look at. And I think that that's critical to having to persevere in this industry, and you have to keep going. You need that type of grounding for yourself to be able to actually translate it.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's kind of education opens so many doors. So learn all you can.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my gosh, Christina, you have given us so many great insights, tidbits, stories here today. As we start to wind down the show here on Masterclass US Wine Market, we like to ask our guests 3 questions to help our listeners better understand the US market and this episode. So do your best, please, to just answer in 1 or 2 sentences. The first question, what is your number 1 tip for mastering the US wine market?
I would say, I feel weird saying mastering. I would say trust your gut and trust the people you're working with guts so that as you are taking that leap of faith, you can, just go forward with the confidence to know what you're doing. Even if you don't, just trust your gut. And if you have to fall down, you can get back up.
Great advice. Great advice. What is something you would have told your younger professional self about selling wine in the US?
Honestly, I would say learn even more than you think you need to learn. Become as knowledgeable as you can on every aspect of the business. There's never a wasted study session when it comes to wine, especially Italian wine.
Great advice. Like we just said, education opens so many doors. Okay, we move around a lot in the wine industry, right? You're traveling near and far to meet producers for market visits. So, what is your favorite travel hack when doing market work?
Ooh. I would say first and foremost, do not forget that you have wine keys in your bag when going through TSA. I would say really nailing down capsule wardrobe for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, and just never forgetting to know where to get a good espresso in whatever market you're in.
Also fantastic advice. I'm the queen of carry-on luggage. Like, whew, if I have to check a bag, it's hard.
I have fallen down the rabbit hole of my Bay, the brand Bay travel carriers and such. And I would say having like little clips or keys or whatnot to trap everything in and make it as small as possible is fantastic.
Good advice. Well, Christina, thank you so much for joining us today
Thank
on
you.
Masterclass US Wine Market, part of the Italian Wine Podcast. How can our listeners connect with you?
If they go on to our social for Dialect Imports, DIALECTIMPORTS. And then my email is Christina@dialectimports.com. So if they want to reach out, learn more about our portfolio, and my personal handle is Crina Babina, CRINABABINA. But otherwise, check out our website and check out our socials to learn more about what we're doing.
Amazing. Thank you again. This has been such a pleasure to talk to you. I wish you all the best, and I hope I really get to meet you in person someday.
Thank you so much. You as well.
Ciao.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Masterclass US Wine Market. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest industry trends, remember to like, follow, and share our podcast. And if you find value in our conversations, please leave us a review to help others discover the show and grow our community. Stay tuned for new episodes every Monday. Until then, brindiamo il vostro successo!